Have you heard of the term gray area drinker and ever wondered if it might apply to you? Did you know that your brain on alcohol is chemically mimicking the effects of cocaine, opioids, and Valium all at the same time? What if the most important question is not how much you drink, but whether if you're in control when you try to stop? And what if I told you that a Cambridge-educated surgeon with over 300 published papers in the scientific community was drinking the equivalent of 60 glasses of wine a week and picking up his kids from school on the way home via the pub? Well, tonight you're going to get those stories and tips and more when we chat with our guest, whom I'll introduce momentarily. But if you're watching this video on the replay, please get into the comments and type the word replay. I'd really like to hear from you. Let me know where you're logging in from, what the weather's like, what's in your glass. And of course, if you're here on the live stream, I'd like to hear from you as well. I'm Natalie McLean, and I teach online wine and food pairing classes, and you've just joined one of the most passionate groups of food and drink lovers who gather weekly every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern to talk to the most interesting people in the world of food and drink. Now, I'm live streaming this video for the first time on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, but it's based on a recorded conversation I had with our guest for the podcast Unreserved Wine Talk. So I will be here, though, live in the comments. I'll jump in, so let us know. What questions are you enjoying? What tips and stories? We want to hear from you. All right, before I introduce our guest, let me just say that 3 of you are going to win a copy of his wonderful new memoir, Why We Drink Too Much, The New Science of Alcohol. All you have to do is email me at natalie@nataliemclean.com and let me know you'd like to win. Now back to our guest. Charles Knowles is Professor of Surgery at Queen Mary University in London, England, and a colorectal surgeon. He has just published his new book, Why We Drink Too Much, The New Science of Alcohol, with Macmillan. It entwines his own journey with an understanding of the effects of alcohol on the body and brain, and how this informs rational approaches to stopping or moderating consumption. He joins us now from his home in London. Charles, we're so glad you could be here with us. Thank you.
No, it's a pleasure to be on your show. I'm in my office, actually, at the university.
Okay.
There we are.
There you go. Work never stops.
Yep.
All right. So let's, now, as I mentioned, you're a professor of surgery at the university, chief academic officer at the Cleveland Clinic in London, author of 300 papers. This is your first sort of popular science book, if you will, for a more mainstream audience. What finally convinced you that this was the story you needed to write, and that you were the one to write it?
Okay. Well, it was a sort of circuitous route to writing this. It started with many people saying you should write a memoir, and I mean that came really by sort of storytelling and various things, and particularly in the music side of things, which I'm involved in, and my producer Nick Tauber, who produced Thin Lizzy and other people, it was his idea first off. And I wrote a memoir, and I guess I'm really not that interesting because literary agents said you'll never get a memoir published. You need to be a major celebrity. But they did comment that what I wrote about alcohol and my relationship with it was interesting. And so, not being one to be beaten, I then thought I'd write a book on alcohol. And that book started out, I guess, from the why me perspective. Why I, out of all of my peer group and other people who started drinking like me as a teenager, did I come to have the problems I had? But as I started writing it, I realized that any reasonable approach to that subject had to start to understand why humans drink alcohol at all. And I can tell you that once I got involved in that, there were many periods where I regretted doing it at all, because it's an incredibly complicated subject.
Right. And yet you make it so relatable, I guess, because your own story is interwoven with the science. I think that really brings it alive.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, having, criticized the memoir, the publishers of the eventual book wanted a lot of the memoir put back in. So it
Yes.
went out and then it came back in again to try and carry the science along, as you say.
Well, I think it's in that category, if you will, of memoir plus. So you learn something. It's, in your case, of course, it's the science, it's the alcohol, but yeah, I just think the two together really work. Now, your scientific training gave you a particular lens, of course, in writing and researching. What did being a clinical researcher allow you to see about alcohol and addiction that perhaps memoir writers, many of whom have talked about their struggles with alcohol, with who don't have your background, that they tend to miss in their writing?
Yeah. Well, one of the things I wanted to do with the book, having read many others in the sort of popular domain, was to make sure it was right. Well, right enough. I mean, as writers, we can be in a subject that's quite esoteric
Sure.
and, brings in areas of sociology, psychology, neuroscience, medicine, many history, because there are a lot of books out there that I think, in an attempt to make them relatable and possibly easy to read, have dumbed down the science to a point where actually it's become factually wrong. And I don't believe, or at least I set out, I hope, in the book that by simplifying anything, it is actually wrong. It is, in as much as we know about it, correct. And that was an important factor in the style of the book. One of the other things was that there are, of course, other writers who have approached this from a prior hypothesis. So, there are many anti-alcohol writers who are
Right.
evangelical, for instance, about people's drinking habits, who have, approached the science from the point of view of using it to show that they're right, rather than showing what it actually shows.
Right.
And I didn't want to make that mistake. And for your viewers, I mean, I'm not anti-alcohol, and I very happy to sit with my friends while they're drinking and to go to pubs, and I have no desire to evangelize, the drinking population. It's up to individuals to look at their relationship with alcohol and how that's working out for them.
Sure. Now, for a man whose entire professional life is built around precision and rigor, was there something deeply uncomfortable about writing in the first person and putting your own vulnerabilities on the page for your family and colleagues and eventually the public to read?
Well, I think I overcame that with the memoir side of things first.
Okay.
I think it was really important to write it in the first person, um, to avoid, as a doctor, being the sort of you people, you and your problems. The I think it does make it more relatable when you're writing in the first person. Um, and I don't think I had any problem with any personal vulnerabilities in this. I was more concerned about the effect it would have on my family and particularly my wife. And of course, in the end, she ended up contributing to the book. So I brought her on the journey with me.
That's a smart strategy. Um, so you open the book in Munich. You're a 13-year-old on a school trip, quickly drinking a full liter stein of German lager before teachers found you and pulled you out. You recently went back and found that exact table, sort of a full circle moment. Describe that.
Yeah, it was sort of interesting to pause and think that's where something started that in many ways shaped the next 30 years of my life. I mean, you could argue it shaped now with the book nearly all of my life. But yeah, and I think the other thing that came from that and is covered in the chapter about learning to drink is I think people can go back and look at their own early experiences with alcohol as a barometer of how that relationship is going to be, because having been alcohol naive to that point and drinking what for a small 13-year-old was quite a lot of alcohol, I absolutely loved it from that first moment.
Yeah.
The no one had to force me to drink that stein of lager. As soon as the effect hit my brain, I wanted more of it. And I think that's a recurring theme that you see among people who have problems later in life and is covered by science, good scientific evidence, that there are early indicators of that enthusiasm. And being someone who can drink a lot and quickly as a teenager is not a good omen
Hmm.
as you go on further in life.
Oh, sure, yeah. You describe it as quite meaningful to revisit the place where you started something. Now, many later life problem drinkers who didn't start when they were that young describe their first encounter with alcohol as feeling like coming home, like it's really them. What did that Stein as a 13-year-old feel like you compared to perhaps what other boys might have been experiencing?
Well, I think I wouldn't reference the 13-year-old period
Okay.
for this, but more the 17-year-old period when I started drinking regularly. I mean, I started, drinking on and off younger than that. The I probably started drinking regularly 17 and socializing with alcohol, and that really was a lights on moment. So I was at boarding school at the time. I hadn't had a particularly easy time at boarding school. There was bullying, and I was a fairly studious, not particularly popular teenager. Uh, what in the day would be described as a nerd, perhaps. Um, and um, and that all changed with alcohol. I mean, seemingly instantaneously. I went from being a sort of not a complete social outcast, but not being one of the boys to being the centre of the party as a result of the enabling effects of alcohol. And I think that's a really important thing because it's positively reinforcing, of
Yes.
course, of that behaviour, and very strongly so. And it is a general heuristic that things earlier on in life that are positively reinforcing are much more likely to be, influential and memorized and harder to change as you go on later in life.
And they're so deeply emotionally rooted, those kinds of experiences. You even note that researchers call it abandonment and bereavement, like especially boarding school. Um, it really does become deeply implanted. So you mentioned that by your early 30s, when you were married, you already knew you had a serious problem long before your first Alcoholics Anonymous AA meeting. What was the internal conversation like? Like, how did you know? Was it just a sense, or was it like, oh gosh, I'm up to this amount of drinking now, or how?
Yeah, it wasn't entirely due to the amount consumed. I mean, even at that stage, amongst the people I hung out with, I wasn't an outlier from the amount of alcohol consumed, nor from sort of crazy behaviour. Um, but I was an outlier from the point of view of getting up in the morning on a Saturday and wanting a drink, and opening the fridge, and of my own mental health, which I knew was deteriorating. And even by that stage, being married, I had a daughter who was one. I had an important job. The anxiety was, you know, well established around my drinking. And I guess I knew because, I was a doctor and to some extent we all know something, but I think everyone knows something of the sort of checklists of are you an alcoholic type of things that used to lie in doctors' surgeries. And it was not lost on me that I was starting to tick off any remaining boxes that were unticked at the time. And so as I looked at that sort of bottle of wine in the fridge in the morning, I realized, I definitely had a major problem because obviously one of the ticks that people very commonly talk about is drinking in the morning.
Huh, interesting. I hadn't heard that one before, but it's a good thing to be cognizant of. So now you argue that alcohol is the world's longest serving and most popular drug. The book traces our ability to metabolize alcohol back 10 million years to hominid ancestors eating fermented fruit from the forest floor. If this drive is older than the species itself, is the modern project of moderation kind of fighting our own biology?
Well, certainly we are fighting our own biology with alcohol. I mean, the 10 million years ago, of course, could be argued was through nutritional necessity. And that's why there was evolutionary pressure to to uh, to gain the gene modifications that we were required to metabolize alcohol safely. at a point where the chimpanzee, separates from the orangutan. Um, but I mean, actually, the deliberate production of alcohol, which is possibly more relevant, goes back 15,000 years, and is roughly coincides with when we started living in groups.
Sure.
Um, what one might say is early civilization as a term. And I think, it more than a coincidence that our deliberate production of alcohol coincides with that, because living in groups requires us to live and cooperate with other human beings. And people talk about social fitness and the um, alcohol's ability, of course, to enable social interactions, which everyone knows to this date, and many, many people use alcohol for, as I did. Um, and in the brain, of course, alcohol has fundamental effects as a primary reward, and it affects, as you noted in your introduction, many neurotransmitter systems that mimic the effects of many other highly addictive drugs. And that's fundamental biology. And perhaps we could get onto it. Maybe I don't want to give a long answer now, but there are aspects of ancient biology here in relation to the reward system and survival that make this particularly challenging to change behavior, particularly when addictions develop.
Yeah. So talk more about that, because I'm wondering if the whole idea of trying to get everyone to moderate drinking is doomed to failure if if it's in our genes to want this kind of reward system and alcohol gives it to us.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's probably, moderation, I think, is possible for a great many people without huge difficulty. It's certainly that it's impossible for anyone who's developed alcohol dependence. I mean, that's my view. It's a view that isn't shared by everyone, but would be shared by most people with any medical, or by psychiatrists and people working in the space, that if addiction has developed in the form of alcohol dependence, you can never safely drink again any amount. And that was my personal experience of it. And it took me 7 years to stop. And any return to alcohol was doomed. I mean, I tried that, and I've met hundreds of other people who have tried it, and and the scientific literature bears that out. And that's because there are different processes at play in someone who is dependent on alcohol from the much wider group of people, which include the grey area. So, for context for the viewers, alcohol dependence, a sort of medical definition,
Mm-hmm.
what used to be called alcoholism, affects between 2 to 3% of most Western populations. Whereas grey area drinking, most people would agree, although it's ill defined, that that's more like 20% of the population. And then, of course, there's another 50% of the population who consume some alcohol and who would be regarded as basically neutral around it. That means they could take it or leave it. And if you asked them to moderate, they would have no difficulty at all. And there's
What about
slightly
those
different
gray areas?
drivers.
Okay. Yeah,
Yeah,
sorry. What about the gray drinkers? How is there a quantity that they're drinking?
no, nothing to do really with amount consumed.
Okay.
It's so grey area drinking doesn't have an exact definition, although I've tried to place a definition on it in the book for the first time. And I would define it as someone who relies on alcohol in a way that makes them concerned about the amount they're consuming and also their ability to change that. And that brings in really two aspects. It brings in something that is defined by the World Health Organization as hazardous alcohol use. So that's the idea that someone recognizes they're consuming alcohol in a way that poses a risk to them, even though those harms have not actually happened. So examples of this are: I come to work hungover, people have commented on it, but I haven't lost my job yet. Um, I got in the car after drinking too much, but the police didn't catch me and I didn't have an accident yet. Um, I'm overweight. I think I'm unfit, but I haven't had a heart attack or developed diabetes yet. So these
Hmm.
are examples of the yets, and many people in the grey area community are worried about those things, or lesser things like their appearance, or their sleep pattern, levels of anxiety, etc. But the definite harms that characterize alcohol dependence and continued compulsion to drink aren't there. The
Okay.
second aspect of it is what I call and define for the first time something called alcohol reliance. So to distinguish it from dependence, because the question I was always getting was, well, I don't think I'm alcohol dependent. And actually, they're right. They're not alcohol dependent because they don't meet the criteria for alcohol dependence. But but there isn't a term that describes my relationship because every time I try stopping, I find it difficult. And that's because people come to rely on alcohol in certain contexts.
Right.
Common ones are like,
The
I need
social
a drink
situations.
after work to
Right.
relax. I
Ah,
rely
yes.
on a drink to socialize.
Mm.
And you can make a list of these. And if you ask people who see themselves as grey area drinkers, they'll tick off many of
Mm.
that list. But they're
Mm-hmm.
not people who have ever seen a doctor for their, relationship with alcohol. And so I think those two things, hazardous alcohol use and reliance, roughly equate with grey area drinking. But even within the grey area, of course, there are lighter and darker shades of grey.
Sure, sure. Wow, fascinating. Um, Now, when you say fermentation predates the toilet by several thousand years, what does that reveal about priorities of early human civilization? Was it first? I mean, you've got also the sort of what is it called? Bread first or beer first? Edward
Yeah,
Slingerhand. We settled down, but we first learned how to make alcohol, and the toilet came several thousand years later.
I did not know about the bread and beer and Edward Slingerhan. You've taught me something. But
Okay.
yeah, well, I mean, I guess it was a bit of a joke in the book, really, because I'm a colorectal surgeon. I'm someone who works at the lower end of the market. The toilets are obviously, something that we joke about. But actually, yes, the first toilets in Mesopotamia do predate the first evidence of the production of alcohol. Um, and and again, it comes back to a theme that runs through the book and is quite complex. But the basic core thesis of this, which I don't think anyone else has raised before, is that social fitness is required for survival
Mm-hmm.
or was required for survival. So in today's world, we think of social fitness as the number of Instagram followers and, how popular you are at school and, the number of likes you get on a Facebook post and things. But you can think back that social fitness, when we first lived in communities together, had a role in survival from the point of view of protection, that you needed to protect yourselves as a group, um, cooperative behavior or reciprocal behavior in the sense of hunting a mammoth or something required, more than one person often, in cooking, looking after children, all of those things for the survival of the species require cooperation. And then finally, of course, there's what's sometimes euphemistically called romantic desirability, but is about passing on the gene through mating. And the in the modern world, you can quite easily see how alcohol fulfills many of those functions. So, we Dutch courage is an example of, we feel braver when we've drunk alcohol. The convivial atmosphere of friends, family, and other things is all about this reciprocal behavior. And of course, we falsely believe that we're more attractive after we've been drinking, or the other person is more attractive
It's true.
after drinking. So the problem is that it's easy to say that, but actually deep in our brains, we may well be working to the historic script. So despite the fact that this seems a crazy notion now, the brain after drinking alcohol is working to the script. Well, actually, I still need this for survival
Ah,
because that's how the brain circuitry works. When you
okay.
change those neurotransmitters with alcohol, they become rewarding. And those sort of survival driven behaviors, and there are psychologists like Alfred Adler, for instance, from Vienna, but I mean, others like Jung have touched on it. The are if you come to falsely believe what Adler called a fictive survival signal, that is helpful for survival, it will be incredibly difficult to change that behavior because it overrides other more rational parts of our newer brain, this
Right.
ancient biology.
Wow, the ancient biology. That's fascinating. So perhaps it's, generational, generation after generation thinking they need alcohol to fit in with the tribe. And here we are out at our wine
Yeah.
bar thinking, oh, it's my biology
Well,
kicking in.
and it may not just be that psychological aspect. I mean, you talk about generation after generation, it may be inherited by epigenetic changes.
Ah,
And this
okay.
is the sort of work that came out of the Dutch starvation, the Dutch famine, that people who were starved by the Nazi blockade of Amsterdam in
Okay.
1944, the parents had children who became obese.
Oh,
And that's
wow.
because the stimulus to eat food
Uh-huh.
when you're starving was carried to their offspring.
That's amazing. I hadn't heard that before. Wow,
I mean,
just
this is a
one
prevailing
generation.
theory in obesity.
Right. Wow. Okay. Okay. Well, now you also note the vervet species of monkeys on the island of St. Kitts are memorable. They have access to fermented sugar cane and self-sort into teetotalers, moderate drinkers, and 5% who drink strong spirits in preference to sweet drinks and show a dependency behavior. Uh, can you describe what researchers observed on that island in concrete detail? Like, is it reflective of the human population? There's always going to be 5%, or do those splits reflect in humans and other species?
Well, I'm sure they do. I mean, a fruit fly has 95% of our genome, a mouse has 99% of it, so a vervet monkey's pretty close to the
Okay,
human species in terms of our biology.
right.
The vervet monkeys steal drinks from tourists. So anyone
Really?
who's been to the island of St. Kitts and left their cocktail while they have a snooze by the pool will find it gone because these monkeys go round and they drink, rum and other things. And it is interesting and a scientific observation that there are a subgroup of vervet monkeys that are used now in alcohol scientific studies because of their development of addiction to alcohol. So this isn't just some, crazy observation. This is a well-studied scientific phenomenon that very much resemble alcohol dependence in humans. And similarly, interestingly, there are about 20% of vervet monkeys who are quite enthusiastic about alcohol but don't develop full-blown dependence, very much like the proportion we have of grey area drinkers. There's similarly a small proportion who won't touch alcohol at all, very much like humans because of intolerance. And so, and the vervet monkey is by no means alone here. So, I mean, Darwin described this in The Descent of Man, how animals drank alcohol. And we know that elephants drink to drunkenness. I mean, there's a whole variety of species, but perhaps best studied in this is mice. So you can recapitulate, that is, you can recreate human behavior in mice by either natural breeding or deliberate genetic manipulation.
Oh,
And you can
okay.
produce a mouse that is a mouse drinking champion. You can produce a mouse that won't touch alcohol at all, and all sorts of mice in between. And the mouse drinking champion will prefer alcohol to food. It can drink more than other mice, shows drunkenness behaviours, and is and compulsion, in some genetic variants of mice. And actually, you can show this in fruit flies as well, remarkably, although quite how you tell when a fruit fly's drunk is something I've never actually observed. I guess. Then again, I haven't ever seen a drunk mouse personally. But but what this tells us, the important point about this, is that it tells us that this is not about, as some people would, coming back to bad science, this is not about advertising or the government not putting enough controls on. Now, I think the government and the alcohol industry are culpable of some things and have had a pretty easy ride on this, but this isn't about this. Alcohol long predates Logie Baird and the television. We didn't need adverts for to create this problem. And the fact that alcohol's drink comes back to this point that alcohol is fundamentally rewarding and is a behavior that animals as well as us will repeat. And it is fundamentally rewarding principally because of the positive effects of alcohol, which are the psychostimulatory and relaxant effects that most people find are fun and also result, in relation to social interaction in a positive outcome, particularly
Sure.
at least until they don't, later on in life.
Right, taken to excess. Wow. Now, you describe alcohol as the primary reward that simultaneously produces stimulatory effects of cocaine through dopamine, the relaxation of opioids through endorphins, and the sedation of Valium through GABA. When wine lovers swirl and sip their first glass of Burgundy, walk us through what's happening inside of the brain in just those first few minutes. Are they all happening at once, or is it kind of layered experience?
Well, nothing much will happen in the first few minutes.
Okay.
The alcohol has to reach the stomach, and really for significant alcohol, some of it needs to reach the small bowel because the stomach isn't very good at absorbing it. Most people start to feel the effects of a glass of wine after 10 to 15 minutes. So, but that doesn't mean, of course, that you won't think you're feeling the effects of it. And that comes to another point here, that once you've learnt to drink, the sort of smell and other aspects, what we call reward cues of alcohol, which can be as small as entering the bar before you've even had a drink and seeing the drink, those are a further problem in some people with their drinking behavior. But
The
what happens,
anticipation
the
alone. Yeah.
anticipation, yeah,
Yeah.
the smells of it and other things. This is particularly in addicted drinkers a particular problem, and we call that reward cues, and it's linked to the ancient biology and craving. Um, but assuming we don't have that phenomenon, after about 15 minutes, some alcohol starts to be absorbed through the stomach, and that alcohol goes via the liver, in the most part, into the general circulation, and then very rapidly gets to anywhere that the general circulation supplies, which has a blood supply, and that's basically the whole body other than cartilage. And the brain has a very high blood flow, so it gets to the brain very quickly. And alcohol, being unique as a chemical almost in being soluble in fat and water, crosses what's called the blood-brain barrier very quickly and effectively, and it then gets to our brain cells via the circulation through the brain. And we're still exploring exactly what happens there, but I think the simple points are that it's absorbed into cells, and that it then affects the connections between cells and their ability to connect to each other by these neurotransmitters, which are the sort of chemical switches. The neurotransmitters released from one side of the chemical switch lands on the other side and turns that nerve on or off in roughly equal balance, because otherwise we'd have uncontrolled brain activity, which happens a bit in epilepsy.
Okay.
Um, and that by drinking alcohol, you're changing the balance of some of those neurotransmitters in certain areas of the brain. Reward is one aspect of that, but as the level of alcohol goes up, the sort of brain-wide effect is on the suppression of brain activity by GABA and by glutamate, which of course leads to the downsides of alcohol in simple terms, which are increasing sedation, drowsiness, clumsiness, and eventually loss of consciousness, and if you carry on drinking, stopping breathing.
Wow. Okay. Now, the James Olds rat experiment showed that rats ignored food to press a lever that stimulated their reward center. What does that tell us about the reward system? It can override almost any other drive, right? I mean, they've proven it, like the rats or the mice, they'll go for the alcohol or the reward, even to the extent of starving themselves.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
starving themselves, particularly seen in the experiments that they do with cocaine and methamphetamine and things in mice. But yes, they stuck a needle into the brain to directly stimulate. It was actually a serendipitous discovery because they went to an area of the brain they weren't intending to. But after that, this was sort of the first discovery of the reward system. And as you say, the rat would press a lever to have this electrical stimulation delivered at the expense of everything else. And the reward pathway is there to serve a very important function in survival. And at least it was in humans. It doesn't subserve a helpful function now, and that's no more evident than in the field of addiction. But the general idea is that you need a deep, fundamental area of the brain in any animal species that can allow you to very rapidly detect things that you need for your survival and to get you away from things that threaten your survival. And so an example of this is being able to spot a brightly coloured set of bananas in the jungle, before someone else eats them, and to
Sure.
spot a brightly coloured snake or spider in the jungle to get away from that before
It eats you.
yeah, before it bites you, and that needs to be done without any consideration of other things or interference from other brain processes. So, you need to be able to be an immediate, almost, instinctive, one might say, reaction to that in both circumstances. And that's what the reward pathway does. It's wired in a way to take precedence over everything else. And so let's take a bee, for example. A bee has a reward system. That reward system enables it to see the brightly coloured petals of the flower, and through seeing those, takes it to the pollen on the stamen of the flower, which it requires for its survival.
Mm-hmm.
A bee does not think, hang on, I'll come back when the weather's better, or when I've finished watching my favourite television programme, or when the flowers turn to a different colour. It needs to find that pollen to survive for another day. So and the problem is that we're left with this system deep within our brains, this ancient biology that once served us very well when we were a chimpanzee or, earlier on in the evolutionary pathway, but now serves no useful function because in society we're not expected to do things in that sort of rash and impulsive manner is often very hazardous, and that's true of taking drugs or misusing alcohol.
Right, right. And you describe a default mode network that acts like a washing machine of thoughts. And you argue that it can pull out the dirty clothes to torment a drinker during a hangover. Maybe you could give us an example, like what's happening in that network that alcohol seems to silence.
Okay, well, it's a sort of little bit trickier than that, but I'll do
Okay.
my best with it.
Yes, please.
So the default mode network is what's called a deep brain network, and it's an example of a lot of, it's not one single area that you can put your finger on. It's bits of lots of areas. And we've only been able to study this since we've had modern neuroimaging methods like functional MRI. And the default mode network can be thought of as the sort of daydreaming area of the brain. So whereas we've got areas of the brain that light up when you make a fist or, or walk or speak or, hear things, this is an area that sort of is to do with more general thinking. And within that general thinking, there are various introspective aspects of it. So it's the area of the brain that compares ourselves with other human beings, that gives us a sense of self-worth. So self-esteem is tied in with this area. It's
Okay.
tied in with memory, particularly emotional memory, and connected to areas like the amygdala, which is sort of an extended part of the network. And so this is an area that we know is disturbed. It's not sort of whether it's on or off more than things, but it's changed, shall we say, in conditions like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It's changed with self-esteem, changed with other neurodevelopmental things, and changed in addiction. And it is the sort of area that, left to its own devices, is probably responsible for the sort of rumination that happens to many people who have, neurotic tendencies, as I do. So experiencing negative feelings, thinking about things over and over again, and and so we talk about the default mode network in the context of the neurobiology of self. It's sort of what makes us ourselves. And in common with ADHD is probably responsible for that washing machine brain that people with
Ruminative, going
ADHD,
over and over
yeah,
things, yeah.
over and over again, which, I experience. And of course, the relation to alcohol of this is that people discover very rapidly when they try that alcohol can suppress that washing machine brain. And so this becomes what we call a negatively reinforcing stimulus, that
Right.
by removing an unpleasant state, it makes you more likely to repeat the behavior.
Mm,
And I think, and I don't write this outright in the book because I can't prove it, but I think experience would tell me, of meeting hundreds of thousands of people, that people who only drink for fun very rarely, if ever, develop significant problems with alcohol dependence, at least from the point of view of addiction.
okay.
They might become overweight and develop liver disease and other things like that.
Sure.
People who drink not just for fun, but drink to self-medicate, to for this negative reinforcement for a variety of reasons, because they require it for social interaction. They require it because they're bored. They require it to suppress this rumination in the brain or
Mm.
relieve anxiety and depression. When that's added in the mix, that is the one of the fundamental drivers of increased risk towards a problematic relationship with alcohol.
That makes so much sense. Like, and so you've got the positive rewards of being social, and then you've got the negative positive rewards of
Yeah,
dampening what's negative. Wow, that's
and the
powerful.
but if you really need and believe, deep in your brain that you need social interaction for survival, you've got that as well.
Right.
So, and of course, many of the conditions that are most strongly associated with alcohol have it all. So if you have ADHD or high functioning autism, the autistic spectrum disorder, you not only have a problem with social interaction, but you have a problem with this rumination. You have depressive feelings, possible anxiety because it overlaps with neurotic personality type. So you've got many of these things in one place. And
Wow.
it's no surprise that disorders that are associated with those things like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, post-traumatic stress disorder, ADHD are those that are most strongly associated with the development of alcohol dependence.
Wow, it's all connected. Wow. Now, you talk about experience dependent neuroplasticity, how the brain subtly changes the strength of connections between nerves so that we learn to drink just like we learn to ride a bike. At what point does the learning tip over from social choice to something more biologically compulsive, or is it just different for everybody, or is there some sort of benchmark?
Okay, well, probably, although imperfectly studied, everyone develops these changes with alcohol. It's really a question of when you pass a threshold of them becoming important. So when we drink, connections will change in the brain subtly. And the more that behavior is repeated, the more those changes will occur and be embedded. And what the brain is really doing is trying to resist injury. So getting drunk is a risk of injury. If you think about it, our brain doesn't want us to be sedated, clumsy, put ourselves at risk. So it's trying to oppose those changes by making subtle changes to our neurotransmitters to try and keep us more alert in the face of alcohol.
Is that
And
called tolerance? Developing tolerance?
well, that is part of the factor in developing tolerance. The liver is the other part of
Okay,
developing tolerance because
right.
it too changes with time. But the problem with these changes, it's several fold, but one problem with these changes is that, of course, when the alcohol leaves the body, we can be left in that hyperstimulated state. And over time, it is thought that that hyperstimulated state, which induces cortisol production and therefore stress and anxiety, gradually becomes embedded. It's this cycling of neurotransmitters that leads to more fundamental changes that underpin withdrawal phenomena in particular. And so addiction really has two aspects to it. One is that pure addiction of the deep desire to have something because of reward, and the other is relief. And really, that you cross the line, as I did, into alcohol dependence when you're drinking for relief. You've really
Relief.
carried that negative reinforcement that you may have started because you had ADHD and because you were bored or unhappy or other things, now into a thing where your brain changes in your brain lead to such an unpleasant feeling when you stop drinking that you need more alcohol to relieve that.
Wow.
And once that is established, as it was, and you asked me about this earlier, that's my early 30s, standing in front of the fridge, that was the first real indicator that I had crossed the line. I knew I'd crossed the line then. And I'm afraid my personal opinion on this, I think borne out by others, is once that line's crossed, the end is inevitable.
Interesting. Wow. Fascinating. Now, you use the concept of cells that fire together, wire together, Donald Hebb's theory to explain how early drinking experience cast a long shadow. Was there in your own life, was there a sensory clue, a smell, a sound, a setting that became wired to that craving for you?
I think for me, I mean, certainly in the latter part of my, well, the problem is that this, was confounded by the obsession to drink from withdrawal of the previous drink. I mean, I reached a
Right.
stage where I used to think about drinking all day, so I was slightly beyond that. But I mean, certainly the phenomenon of getting into the pub, the lift as you got into the pub, or the first sip of drink. Yes, I mean, those were very real phenomena for me. But if I wind right back to you know, when I look back with the benefit of hindsight, I was different from my early 20s. So when other people got up in the morning groaning with a hangover, you know, I would be up bright and early and getting another beer out of the fridge.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
I didn't
Right.
get hangovers like other people.
Right.
And I mean,
Well,
I had a very high tolerance for alcohol from the start. I
mm-hmm.
mean, uh, 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 and being able to drink other people under the table is not an advantage when it comes to problems later in life. It is
Sure.
shown to be a disadvantage.
Sure. Sure. Wow. Now, you use the phrase drinking companion phenotype to describe people who are genetically primed to feel more reward from every sip than the average person. Um, what does it feel like to be one of those people compared to someone who finds a single glass of, or a single glass of wine simply makes them mildly relaxed or sleepy? Is it just, it's just more powerful surges of that dopamine and the other neurotransmitters?
Yeah. So, I mean, this has been very well studied in mice and it's been studied in humans, and it relates to alcohol sensitivity
Okay.
and stimulation. So you can look at alcohol sensitivity from various aspects. One aspect of it is intolerance. So there are a group of people who are properly intolerant to alcohol, who have Asian flushing syndrome, who will almost never ever develop a problem with alcohol because it's a deeply unpleasant experience to drink. Then there's probably a group of about 10% of the population who really don't like drinking. It makes them feel a bit sick and they just don't like the experience.
Hmm.
At the other end of the spectrum, there are people who are highly tolerant of it, as I was, who can drink a lot without falling over. I mean, in all the years I drank, I could always make it home. I never had injuries and things from it.
Right.
And then the second aspect of this is alcohol related stimulation. And this is where some of the other mice experiments come in, our drinking champion mouse. So, whereas some people are slowed by alcohol and, sort of sit in the corner looking a bit miserable, other people are highly stimulated by alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
These and that can be replicated in mice, and makes you more likely to be preferring to drink, and puts you at a high risk. And there are cohort studies, like the San Diego cohort study, ran for 35 years, that took teenagers who were alcohol naive, gave them a measured amount of alcohol, and looked at how stimulated they were and how they felt. And the ones that were most stimulated and had the, most subjective pleasure from the experience went on to have the highest risk 30 years later of being alcoholic.
Wow.
Funnily enough, and quite ironically, I did that experiment at school.
Oh, okay.
And I only remembered about this really when I was writing the book,
Really?
that these
Okay.
people had come into our school to do this experiment. And I must have been 17 or 18 at the time. And and I remember it because we were given vodkas to drink. It was sort of mid-afternoon, and lots of people, really didn't want to drink the vodka. And what some of them drank one vodka and thought, I don't feel good. So I ended up drinking several other people's vodkas.
Well,
And the moral of this story is do experiments in mice because humans are unreliable. But it does paint a picture of of how early on those
yeah.
differences were there and how this is rooted in biology.
Wow. Yeah, biology, because you say twin and adoption studies show that about 50% of the risk for developing alcohol dependence is genetic. You write that finding the relevant genes is like looking for thousands of needles in a haystack, some of which look very much like hay.
Yeah.
Um, for the ordinary person who wants to understand their own risk without genetic testing, what are the most revealing questions they can ask themselves? I mean, you've pointed out some already. Can you control if you stop? That is it. Are you relying? Are you drinking to relieve? I mean, is there anything else you'd add to
Yeah.
that, or we covered it?
Well, the first to be clear is there is no genetic testing that will help you. The only
Okay.
genetic tests that we have are for alcohol intolerance,
Ah.
not for increased alcohol risk.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm just fiddling with my earphone here.
Sure.
The And that's because of the complexity of it.
Okay.
Um, I mean, I dare say that one day on things like 23andMe and other large ancestry sites, the risk of developing this will be from a polygenic perspective of looking across hundreds of areas of the genome, be able to give you a small percentage change in risk, but we're not going to be able to get to a test where there's one gene. We know there isn't. So
Right.
um, so we are left with looking at, nevertheless, of course, if you have an alcoholic parent, um, our risk with an alcoholic parent is 4 to 10 times that of a person who doesn't have an alcoholic parent, based
Wow.
on historic studies of alcoholism starting in the 1960s, and that's
Okay.
been replicable across all studies. So that's one risk factor to think about, even if we can't find the genes. Um, Early age of onset of drinking is another risk factor, although that's tied up in a number of other confounding things, perhaps in the environment at home,
Hmm.
etc. But it's independent of whether you have a parent. Having an identical twin who is alcoholic is a very, very high risk factor
Hmm.
because of the obviously having an identical genome. And then we're into behavior. And I think we've covered some of these. I mean, I like to think, and I mean, I am overstepping the science here, that, if I walk in a bar, I can see or spot the people who aren't there for the fun,
Hmm.
you know.
What would you be looking for? Are they just maybe
Well, it's
on
a
their
sort of
own, or they're
nervous
just
disposition.
okay?
I mean, actually, the French doctor who discovered baclofen as a treatment for alcohol dependence.
What is the treatment?
Baclofen. It's only licensed
Baclofen.
in France, so it's not licensed anywhere else, although people do use it in other places. It's a drug that was developed for restless leg syndrome, and for and so it and the thing he observed in himself and others um, was that people who had problems with alcohol were constantly fidgeting and tapping their feet. And I think probably what he was observing was that the overlap with ADHD and hyperactivity.
Interesting. Huh.
But that sort of nervous disposition, I mean, I see it in AA meetings all the time, people tapping and things. I think, and a sort of intensity of approach to the drink are sort of things that you can look at. Now, over and above that, um, the amount consumed and regularity of consumption has a weak correlation with that. I mean, obviously, people who drink very little are at very little risk of developing a problem. The opposite is not, however, true, that people who drink a lot are roughly dispersed across the spectrum.
Okay.
So drinking a lot does not equate well with dependence. There are many people who drink a lot who are completely neutral around alcohol. And in fact, I've met many of them, even in the music industry, people who can drink on tour and then just stop when they come home,
Wow.
despite really going for on tour. I know people who can drink 6 months of the year and not drink other 6 months of the year. And, these would drink with the best of them. That was not my experience. I drank really on the face of it much less than these people, but I found it very difficult to stop. And
Right.
so consumption's not a great marker of it. I think later on in the spectrum of it, if you are starting to experience harms from drinking or even hazards, worries about harms, and you then can't modify that relationship, I think that's when most people start to think maybe I have a problem.
Okay.
And
Okay.
obviously, the
That's
greater
right.
those harms become and the more obvious they are, you're then into, if you're at the time when everyone's telling you you need to stop, including the police, a judge, your doctor, your wife, and then you can't stop, that we're into alcohol dependence.
Yeah. Yeah. I was thinking, then the Undertaker. It's too late.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the fading effect bias, our programmed tendency to inflate the pros and easily forget the cons of a night of drinking. How does this cognitive quirk make it so hard for gray area drinkers to get an honest read on their behavior?
Um, well, I mean, you've said it quite accurately. It sort of
It's,
ties in with choice. So obviously, to a greater or lesser extent, all of us choose whether we want to have a drink or not. I
mm-hmm.
mean, it doesn't just make our way into, our body on its own. We have to go out, purchase it, put it in a glass, raise it to the mouth. So there is a choice element in this. Now, that choice can become eroded to a point where you have dependence, and that resisting that choice becomes very difficult. But in the grey area, there are several things that act against us in making a rational choice. The first is that we're not very good at making rational choices, even as humans. And this comes back to the work of people like Daniel Kahneman, drinking fast, drinking fast and slow,
Thinking
thinking
fast.
fast and slow.
Yeah.
Um, um, the um, that we don't tend to use logical reasoning very often. We're lazy, basically, and most of the decisions we make in life are not subject to any great logical rationale. And so, the sort of thinking that underpins, shall I have a drink before getting in the car, before going home? Well, I'm a good driver, my mates do it, I've only had one drink, police don't come in this area, etc., is the sort of crazy lack of rationale that most humans exert, and we've all been there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so we're up against it here because that system two thinking that Daniel Kahneman talks about, which is this sort of rather more impulsive, instinctive hunch thinking, is extremely prone to bias and
Okay.
bias from experience. And one of the aspects of that bias is what you touch on, a fading effect bias. So, in making decisions in the future and looking at our past memories, we have a tendency to favour the positives rather than the negatives in making future decisions. And that's the fading effect bias. There are other aspects to that bias, and but that's the crux of it.
Hmm. Right. Now let's talk about your own life a bit more. You write at the peak of your drinking, you're consuming roughly 10 times the recommended weekly limit. A 2012 survey in the Journal of Archives of Surgery found that 14% of male surgeons and 25% of female surgeons in the US showed some degree of alcohol use disorder, far above the adult population. Why do you think the rates for doctors in general and women specifically in surgery are much higher than the population? Is it just the immense pressure and hours of the job?
I think it's a number of things. And this comes back to a point I've already made about amount consumed versus risk of alcohol use disorder. I mean, actually, industries like construction and the entertainment industry, on average, drink far more than doctors do. But doctors have this much higher level of risk of developing dependence and problems with alcohol. And there are various things that are attributed to that, and there are papers written on burnout, on the stress of the job, particularly on the threat of failure and of shame and other aspects. But I do think there's something more in this. I think surgery selects for a group of people who are more like me. So people who are driven in a way and are possibly have more of some of the risk factors earlier on in terms of being at risk in later life. It's to do with personality traits, some of which are linked to a higher risk of substance misuse. Maybe the precious boarding school, all sorts of things, as it was for me, could be tied in to this. I mean, Carrie Cunningham, for instance, who is an academic surgeon in the US, amazing surgeon, amazing academic. And she encountered this problem, and there's a her address to the Academic Surgical Society is harrowing to watch. I mean, it really is. But I mean, this was a woman who played Wimbledon 4 times.
Wow.
When she was a teenager. Someone driven at everything she did.
Yes.
Someone highly successful at everything she did. And I think that phenotype is at higher risk than, the happy-go-lucky type of person.
Fascinating. Wow. There is something paradoxical, though, about a profession, built on precision, like surgery is, and the absolute sanctity of the body, being so overrepresented in alcohol dependence. Do you think the culture of medicine actively enables heavy drinking in ways that other high-pressure professions don't?
Yeah, well, I mean, my generation of doctors were introduced to a culture of drinking. I mean, certainly in the UK. And so at university, at Cambridge, then at medical school in London, I mean, there was a culture of heavy alcohol use. When I first started as a junior doctor, we had a phone extension in the local pub so that you didn't have to leave to answer your bleep. There was a social club within the hospital where consultants drank at lunchtime.
Wow.
And so, this culture that's changed. I mean, let's be clear, this has very much changed now. But it's no great surprise that many of us, having been introduced to that culture, went on to continue it. And then, of course, you reach a point for people like myself where you no longer have much of a choice in it. It was fun for a while everyone was having fun doing it, and it was de rigueur. But by the time you get to 40 and you're a consultant in, the 2000s, when it's no longer acceptable and you've got a problem, then, you're on your own. And the problem is, of course, in the medical profession, you can't really talk about it. And so one of the purposes of my book, and possibly the most rewarding purpose of it, has been to raise my head above the parapet and come out as a senior and quite successful surgeon and say, this happened to me. And since I've written that book, I've had numerous letters from other doctors, including very senior doctors, saying, I've been in exactly the same predicament, never been able to talk about it. So
That's
pleased
great.
that you've published this book.
That's got to be one of the most rewarding aspects of publishing the book.
Oh, it is the most rewarding aspect of publishing it.
That gives me goosebumps. Yes, absolutely. I mean, my own memoir is about drinking too much in the alcohol industry, where we don't talk about it either, because everybody's supposed to maintain this professional decorum, and we just drink for enjoyment. But yeah, the stories come flooding in.
To give you some perspective on this, some of the letters I've received have been handwritten letters posted because those people still fear sending an email.
Wow. Yeah. The shame and stigma, and yeah. Wow. So your son's christening in 2005 became a turning point. You got drunk and had a stand-up argument with uh, Annie's father. That week you went to your first AA meeting. Can you describe what that felt like?
Yeah, I mean, the game was up long before this christening, but that was really and I had, this was just the coup de grace really in the situation. And really at that time, the only thing I knew was AA. I mean, it was really one of the only things that anyone knew, and I knew I was an alcoholic. And so I rang the helpline, and two very nice guys took me to my first meeting at Toynbee Hall in the East End of London. Um, the One of them I still know today. I mean, and I thought it was good. I'm not someone who was anti. Lots of people come to AA and they hate it. Some of them stick it out and then they think it's the best thing that ever happened to them. Others walk away from it. And I'm not here to advertise AA, to be clear. That's a tradition in AA, attraction, not advertisement. Um, but certainly I've always found it very helpful. And I went to it and I got it, in the sense of, I listened to it and I thought, it wasn't that I went there and thought, that isn't me. um, you know, that this is, I need to, I'm not that bad, or I'm things. Did think I was that bad, and I did think I was amongst people who had the same problem, albeit from all sorts of different walks of life. Um, but the problem was I just didn't really get it, or at least I stopped for a bit and then was gradually persuaded to restart. Um, and I mean, this is the nature of the beast.
Right.
There are people who get it first time, but for most of us, the um, stopping drinking is not the sort of uh, blaze of glory that is on, leaving Las Vegas or something. I mean,
Right. Right. The
the
glamorized.
it's
Mm-hmm.
it requires getting sick and tired of being sick and tired. And so for me, it took 7 years
Right.
of
Right.
going back and forth from AA, variably investing time and energy. I didn't ever fully work the 12-step program, and maybe I just needed to descend lower, which eventually I got to in Florida
And what
seven
happened
years
there
later.
in Florida?
So I'd mostly been off drinking, and this is, a point about why I say you can never safely drink again if you're alcohol dependent, is because you can spend a year, not drinking and getting better, but within 3 days of drinking, it'll be back on you, as it was always on me. And there were a number of other factors. I'd been using running as a sort of antidote to drinking, as well as AA meetings, and a mixture of elite running, well, near elite running, or shall we say crazy running, um, um, uh, and occasional AA meetings was keeping me on the straight and narrow. I then got injured out of running, became depressed, a number of other things. Thought a holiday in Florida with the family would be the saving grace. Be with my wife, have a few drinks, it'll be fine, we thought. No, it wasn't fine. I'd started drinking I'd started drinking the day before we got to the airport. And within about 3 days into the holiday, I was suicidal.
Wow. Yeah.
And yeah, it was not good at all.
Huh.
That was the day after that was the last drink. I woke up kneeling on the floor of a bedroom in my friend's house in Florida, praying to any God that would listen, withdrawing from alcohol. And this thought, and it wasn't that it hadn't happened before. The night before wasn't, any worse than some other nights before, but I just knew I could never drink again. I just did not have one more episode of this left in me. And that was 10 years ago, and I haven't had a drink again.
Congratulations.
And I hear that
Whew.
from lots of people.
Yeah.
It's not the car crash or the being sent to prison. It's for most people it comes a point where the pain of carrying on is greater than the pain of stopping.
Now, the medical establishment prefers the word alcohol use disorder. It's a clinical term that conveys a spectrum without a stigma. You use the word alcoholic deliberately instead. Does the clinical language help people, or does the bureaucratic precision of alcohol use disorder, which I find clumsy, but anyway, allow a comfortable distance from what is fundamentally a very raw human condition?
Yeah, I don't have a strong, to be clear, I don't have a strong feeling on this, and I think people need to use a term for themselves that they feel happy with and they don't feel is shameful or negative in any way. I personally like the term alcoholic because it sort of says what's in the tin, and everyone knows what it is. So if I'm asked, the sort of, I'll go on, have a drink, I say, no, I'm an alcoholic, which does tend to stop any further requests.
Sure.
And the alternative to that is, no, sorry, I've got a severe alcohol use disorder or a mild alcohol use disorder. Doesn't quite have the connotation of this. And so that's my personal preference. One important thing here, however, is that alcohol use disorder is not synonymous with alcoholic.
Okay.
Alcoholism is synonymous with alcohol dependence, which is the World Health Organization definition, and that is just about synonymous with severe alcohol use disorder, so that category within it. But mild and moderate alcohol use disorder are not the same thing. And so one of the problems we've got at the moment is people using these interchangeably.
Huh. All right. That's good to know.
It's why I try to be clear in the book when I'm talking about alcoholism, when I'm talking about alcohol use disorder. And it's probably one of the things that's muddled the genetics.
Okay.
Because the findings in alcoholism are not the same findings necessarily as in alcohol use disorder.
Okay. Good to clarify that. Now, your book ends with what you describe as a 12-principle blueprint for reclaiming your choice around alcohol. Which of those principles tends to make the biggest difference in people's lives?
Ooh. Well, that's putting me on the spot. I mean,
maybe you need all 12. You definitely need to buy the book.
You definitely don't need all 12.
No?
But
okay.
I think I will focus on one for now, is the one size doesn't fit all.
Okay.
If someone comes up to you and they tell you, I know what the solution is for a problem like you, it's X, Y, and Z, give them a wide berth, because there is no unifying solution to this problem. There are scientific themes that underpin all successful approaches across the spectrum of this, which I allude to in the book. But I think there isn't a single size fits all. Over and above that, possibly number two, is that the problem is in your head, not the glass. And this ties in with the idea that this is a thinking disorder. We got into it by learning to drink. We can't unlearn it because it's learnt, it's memorized. And so any solution to this that has any credibility has got to focus on thinking, because you can't unlearn it any more than you can unlearn to ride a bike. If you go back 10 years later, you still know how to ride a bike. So so this does require different thinking approaches, and that is a cognitive approach in just the same way as we learn to drink. We need to learn other things to approach that. Those are probably two, I guess. If I'm allowed to mention some others, I think one of the second major themes of this is very difficult to address any significant problem with alcohol alone.
Right.
So this is not something to fight alone. There's a power of community in this, and most successful approaches involve a community-based approach. I'll stop there before I end up reading out all 12.
But you do argue self-compassion is a core ingredient in sustainable recovery, in contrast to the shame-driven model underlying so much of conventional treatment. Um, so what does self-compassion look like in a very concrete moment when someone is standing in front of an open bottle that they promised themselves they wouldn't open? What does self-compassion mean? Is it just thinking of treating yourself well in a better way, that it's not the reward is in the bottle?
Yeah, that sort of conflates a number of things. I mean, yeah, it is very important to not go into the blame game here,
Mm-hmm.
from two aspects, really. One is that you don't want to be blaming yourself. Very often, as my book, the book is Why We Drink Too Much. So the whole book is focused on why humans drink and why we drink too much. And, when I first went to AA meetings, I thought I had no legitimate reason to be there, in the sense that this was my own fault. I drunk my way to this. My own behaviour had got me here. I hadn't suffered abuse as a child. I came from a good background, went to a good school, all of those sort of things, had a good job, had a nice wife, etc. And this was all my own making. Years on now of writing the book, there are a good number of reasons why I got this problem, not least a diagnosis of ADHD, a neurotic personality trait, um, uh, the problems at boarding school, etc., my job, and various other things. And so I think, we don't want to get into the self-blame game. On the other hand, I also don't think it's helpful to go blaming a lot of other people. They might be to blame, but that actually won't help solve the problem. So berating the government for not doing something about alcohol labelling or minimum pricing, or berating um, um, the fact that the pub was open too late, or that the alcohol industry had it too easy. They're cheap shots. They're a vogue narrative, but actually don't help the individual get better. And similarly, holding resentments against other people for what's happened in the past, may well be valid, but it doesn't actually help. So the and this all comes back to this change in thinking and looking really forwards rather than backwards. And I think it's worth pointing out here that that sort of why me aspect, which is what much of my book is about, is not actually necessary to do at all. And I mean, I don't. Some people may have read A. Gill's book, Poor Me, and at the beginning of that book, he makes this beautiful analogy, but far better than I could ever write. But then, it's a fantastic writer, where he talks about someone who's stranded at sea, floating in the ocean, being visited by two boats for rescue, and the people come up to him, and one boat will rescue him, and the other will tell him how he got there. You've got to pick the boat that rescues you. So
Right.
I'm sorry, I haven't done A. Gill any justice really to his
He's a
literary
marvelous
art
writer
on that.
too.
But
Yeah.
but that is an important point. I don't think it's actually necessary to study this at all. What's much more important is looking forwards rather than backwards, about what a positive future can hold rather than a negative past. And we certainly, you don't want the King Lear in this. Who is it who can tell me who I am? You're a shadow of your former self. You can't become a non-drinking persona. You have to become a new person. You mustn't be defined by what you're not anymore.
Wow, those are great words to wrap up on, from King Lear to your own journey. Is there anything we haven't covered, Charles, that you'd like to mention before we wrap up?
No, we've covered an enormous amount here. I wish everyone, as I say, to reinforce, I'm not. This is an alcohol and food, drink and food thing, and I'm not a zealot about alcohol. And I do think maybe one thing we haven't covered is I have said, I don't support this sort of anti-corporate and anti-government narrative as being helpful. I do think that we're under-informed
Okay.
on the health risks, particularly of alcohol. And I think we should be afforded more health information on it, in
Mm-hmm.
the way that we have been with smoking and other things that
Mm-hmm.
are hazardous. And that would be my only thing there. So I think people who are watching this and want to look at their own relationship with alcohol should come to understand what those risks are. I mean, they're in my book, they're in many other places. And then, have a look at it. Think, how much am I consuming? What are the consequences of that consumption? And if I wanted to stop, how much control have I really got of this? And I think that guides this, where you need to go in terms of changing something if you want to change it.
Right, right. Great. Where can people best find you and the book online?
So the book is available at all good bookstores.
Okay.
I think in Canada, US, and the Commonwealth, and the UK. It's available at Amazon and all the usual online places. And my website is charlesknowlesauthor.com, I think. And one thing I would say about the website, which isn't anywhere else, is I'm doing this sort of paper of the month thing. So I am, every month I look at the scientific literature and I pick a high impact paper in the science and I debunk that into a short thing that summarizes it for public consumption.
How
So it
interesting.
might be something on genetics from Nature, or it
Okay.
might be something from the Lancet on, some population study. But every month there'll be a new entry on there. And lots of Q&A on my website as well.
Terrific for people who want to dive deeper, but they should get your book for sure, Why We Drink Too Much. It's been a pleasure, Charles, talking to you. Thank you so much, and especially for giving us you have this deep, rich scientific background, for putting it into terms that we can understand and ask questions of ourselves, those of us who do like a glass or two or more. So thank you for your time. I'll say goodbye now, but please don't log off, and appreciate it.
Thank you, Natalie. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, cheers. All right, that was great.